Have you ever wondered what shakes a narcissist to their very core? What moment makes them realize that their control was an illusion and that someone they underestimated was never theirs to manipulate? The answer comes in the quiet, the stillness after you step away. The invisible hand that moves when the heavens declare a shift. When God separates a soul from a narcissist, it is not subtle. It does not whisper. It announces itself with a clarity that pierces every lie they have built in that instant. The narcissist watches what they thought was fragile walk calmly from their reach. They believe the retreat is a surrender, a breaking point, but the truth is far greater. You were never fragile. You were never dependent. You were placed there as an instrument of mercy, a shield, and a vessel of divine purpose. Every tear they misread as weakness. Every moment of patience they saw as fear. Every act of forgiveness they mistook for submission was actually spiritual strength, a strength they could not comprehend and could not counterfeit. Before we begin this journey, it is a blessing to know from which part of the world you are watching, and at what hour of the day God has guided you to this message. Truly, it is a joy to witness how the Lord gathers hearts from every corner of the earth, uniting them in one spirit and in one truth. They believed they were in control, interpreting your silence as fear and your gentleness as vulnerability. Yet, in reality, heaven had held your voice and tempered your actions. The power you carried was restrained, not because it lacked force, but because it was meant to unfold at the perfect time. They did not see that every moment they assumed they dominated the emotional battlefield. God had already set the terms. Your endurance, your discernment, your quiet obedience were forces that safeguarded both yourself and them, long before they realized it. Then comes the moment of revelation, the truth they were never prepared to face. God tells them, "You were never the one who needed saving. You were the one I sent." It is not a gentle insight, but a verdict that dismantles their narrative, strips away pride, and confronts them with their own failures. Every assumption they held about your weakness crumbles, replaced by the undeniable realization that the one they thought was under their control was, in fact, carrying a weight they could never bear. And in that moment, the narcissist collapses, not because of words spoken by you, not because of confrontation, but because the spiritual authority behind your presence is revealed. Every restraint, every silent prayer, every moment of obedience has been a shield, a mercy, a hedge of protection they never earned. And now, with you stepping away, they face a reality they cannot hide from. The grace that preserved them was tied to you, and without it, they must stand alone. This is only the beginning. The depth of what follows will reveal not just their fear, but the full consequences of a life that mistook your calling for weakness. What happens when the narcissist finally realizes that everything they relied on, the manipulation, the charm, the fear they thought they inspired, was powerless against the force of divine intention? That is the moment their world begins to unravel. For years, they assumed the calm in their life was a reflection of their control, that the absence of chaos was proof of their superiority. Yet, the truth is far different. The peace they took for granted was never theirs. It belonged to the obedience, restraint, and mercy carried by the one they dismissed. When God withdraws that presence, it is not punishment. It is revelation. Suddenly, the environment they believed they mastered becomes unstable. Doors that once opened with ease remain shut. opportunities that flowed naturally dry up. Relationships falter not because others reject them, but because the grace that once softened their path has moved away. They are left to confront the consequences of their choices without the buffer that shielded them. This is the harsh, unfiltered reality of life without the spiritual covering that had been silently sustaining them. The narcissist is confronted with a truth they could never prepare for. The person they demeaned, dismissed, and misread was never vulnerable. Instead, they were a vessel of divine purpose, a force of spiritual authority, a weapon of mercy that preserved balance in the chaos. Every time they tried to provoke anger or test patience, it was not fear that kept an explosion at beat, was discipline and obedience aligned with heaven. They discovered that the one they thought was dependent was actually holding together a stability they themselves could not maintain. And here comes the crushing clarity. God was not protecting them from you. He was protecting you from them. Every moment of restraint, every act of measured silence was a divinely orchestrated shield. They had mistaken your obedience for weakness, your silence for submission, and your compassion for fragility. Now, stripped of that protective presence, they are forced to face themselves, exposed to the consequences of choices that were long delayed by your faithfulness. The narcissist sees the weight of a future unsoftened by your grace. The reality of life without the spiritual buffer they never earned crashes down around them. Their world, once seemingly effortless, begins to feel unpredictable and harsh. The structures they relied upon collapse. Every manipulation, every deceit, every strategy they perfected is met not with acquiescence, but with the natural result of actions unshielded by grace. And yet, the most devastating revelation is not the external obstacles. It is the internal emptiness, the recognition that they were never the anchor, the one they dismissed, overlooked, or attempted to control, was always the source of true stability, the bearer of strength, the carrier of divine authority. Your presence was a hedge of protection they could never comprehend. Their collapse is complete not because you left, but because they never realized the true power and assignment that walked beside them all along. And as the narcissist confronts this truth, one question rises above all. How could they have misread every moment, every gesture, every word? They see now that what they assumed was weakness was far greater than anything they themselves possessed, and they are left with nothing but the consequences of their misjudgment. The next stage will uncover how this collapse unfolds in the unseen spiritual realm and the subtle ways divine timing exposes every hidden fault. Have you ever wondered why the narcissist cannot simply recover when the protective presence is gone? It is because the person they underestimated was never ordinary. They were sent with a purpose, with divine timing, and with a weight of spiritual authority the narcissist could not bear. Every act of patience, every moment of silence, every gentle correction was calibrated by heaven to protect, restrain, and preserve balance not for them, but for the one carrying the grace. And now, when that presence is removed, they are forced to stand in the absence of a protection they never acknowledged. The narcissist begins to see the truth in ways that shake their identity. They realize that every scenario they believed they controlled was subtly guided by a higher hand. The peace they attributed to their cleverness, the calm they assumed reflected their dominance, was never theirs to wield. Every crisis that did not explode, every anger they failed to provoke, every manipulation that fell flat. These were the results of divine restraint operating through someone they belittled. And yet, understanding this truth brings fear, not humility. Fear, because for the first time, they are exposed to the consequences of their own heart without mitigation. They discover that the one they assumed was fragile carried a strength far beyond their capacity to comprehend. Strength forged through trials, tempered by patience, and directed by divine wisdom. Every act of control they executed against this person was ineffective because they underestimated the spiritual armor and authority operating quietly beside them. Now, the narcissist is forced to witness the unraveling of the environment they thought was under their dominion. Life becomes unpredictable. Favor that once seemed automatic feels distant. Obstacles they once ignored now block their path. Relationships they expected to bend to their influence falter or fail entirely. The charm, the manipulation, the tactics, they no longer work. The world responds not to their illusions of power, but to the reality of consequences that have been long deferred. And here is the deepest wound. They grasp that what they lost was irreplaceable. It was not a companion, not someone to entertain or validate them. It was the vessel of mercy, the shield of grace, the one God sent to hold space for their chaos. Every relationship they attempt afterward will reveal the void, the absence of the spiritual covering that once stabilized their world. Their loss is structural, not sentimental. They are facing the collapse of the very foundation they had taken for granted. Yet, even in this reckoning, the narcissist does not fully see the wisdom in restraint. They only feel the weight of exposure. They did not recognize that every restraint, every silence, every act of measured obedience was meant to preserve timing and purpose, not to shield weakness. They assumed they were the master of the emotional battlefield, but in truth, they had only ever been participants in a story guided by divine authority beyond their comprehension. And as they confront this, one final, sobering realization begins to surface. The absence of the one they dismissed is no longer a void that can be replaced. The grace, the authority, the restraint that once hovered unseen in their life cannot be duplicated. Their collapse is complete, and they are left to face what they themselves created. The next section will reveal the exact moment they recognize that what they lost was not just a person, but the spiritual weapon assigned to restrain them. What happens when the narcissist finally realizes the full measure of the loss? This is not the simple absence of a companion. It is the sudden exposure to a reality they were never prepared to endure. For years, they believed they were untouchable, that their words, their manipulation, their charm gave them control. They assumed that the calm around them was proof of their superiority. But now, with the one sent to shield them removed, everything changes. The environment shifts, favor feels distant, and the stability they counted on evaporates. The narcissist begins to understand that every moment they misjudged the one they tried to control was a mistake of colossal proportions. What they interpreted as fragility was strength. What they assumed to be fear was obedience to divine timing. Every gentle restraint, every patient pause, every quiet endurance was not weakness, was the strategic movement of heaven, operating through a vessel they mocked and misunderstood. And the weight of this realization is crushing. As they observe the consequences of their own actions now coming into focus, the narcissist feels the raw impact of what they once took for granted. Every disruption they caused, every lie they told, every act of selfishness that previously seemed inconsequential now stands fully exposed. They see that the intercession, the protection, the spiritual covering that had shielded them is gone. And for the first time, they are forced to confront the chaos they themselves created without the buffer of grace that once softened the impact. And with this understanding comes fear, a fear unlike anything they have experienced. They realize that they are standing alone before the natural result of their choices, unshielded and unprotected. The emotional manipulation that once worked like a charm now falls flat. The relationships they believed they could bend to their will falter under the weight of truth. The narcissist recognizes that the life they thought was effortless was maintained not by skill, but by the quiet presence of a vessel sent to stabilize the storm. Then comes the piercing truth. The one they dismissed, the one they abused, was never just a companion. They were a spiritual weapon, a divine intercessor assigned to hold the balance of their life and to restrain the consequences of their pride. And now, with that vessel removed, the narcissist sees that the ease, the comfort, and the favor they assumed were theirs by merit have disappeared. Their illusions of control crumble as they face the reality that the person they scorned was the reason that the world around them did not fall apart sooner. The magnitude of this revelation leaves them unmoored. They realize that they were never in command. They had been walking under the protection of someone whose obedience and patience carried a weight they could not measure. And now they must navigate the world without the covering, without the restraint, and without the mercy that once softened the impact of their actions. As the narcissist confronts this collapse, the next revelation looms even larger. They begin to comprehend that what they lost cannot be replaced, duplicated, or substituted. The grace and spiritual authority that once hovered in their life has gone, leaving a void that exposes every hidden weakness, every unresolved consequence, and every fractured part of their character. As the narcissist confronts this collapse, the next revelation looms even larger. They begin to comprehend that what they lost cannot be replaced, duplicated, or substituted. The grace and spiritual authority that once hovered in their life has gone, leaving a void that exposes every hidden weakness, every unresolved consequence, and every fractured part of their character. Have they ever truly understood what it meant to stand unshielded? When the narcissist faces life without the one sent to guard them, they encounter the raw outcome of every misstep, every manipulation, and every attempt to bend others to their will. The absence is not merely physical, it is spiritual, emotional, and structural. The protection they relied on was never there on it, was a gift, a covering placed by heaven through a vessel they overlooked, underestimated, and often despised. For the first time, the narcissist feels the weight of their own choices. Opportunities that once appeared effortlessly now meet resistance. Relationships that seemed secure unravel quickly. The influence they wielded over others diminishes. It is not punishment in the traditional sense, but a direct consequence of the life they built without accountability. The world responds to their character, not their charm. Deception and manipulation are no longer shields. They are mirrors reflecting the truth they long ignored. They begin to notice the loneliness that has always surrounded them. Not the kind that comes from being alone, but the kind that arrives when there is no genuine connection left. The connections they thought were under their control now reveal themselves as fragile, conditional, and hollow. Each interaction emphasizes the void left by the absence of the one who stood in the gap, absorbing chaos, offering stability, and restraining the storms their behavior caused. Suddenly, every assumption they held about their power is questioned. The narcissist realizes that the calm, patience, and grace they mistook for weakness were instruments of divine timing, not flaws to exploit. Every restraint was deliberate, designed to prevent their world from collapsing before its appointed moment. The truth stings. They were not controlling the narrative. They were contained within a story shaped by someone else's obedience to higher authority. This revelation forces them to confront the irreplaceability of the lost presence. They understand that no charm, apology, or new relationship can substitute the spiritual weight that once rested in your hands. The equilibrium they enjoyed was borrowed. The mercy that delayed consequences was tied to your faithfulness, not to their behavior. And now the balance has shifted. The storms they once avoided have arrived, and nothing remains to soften the blow. As the narcissist begins to grasp this reality, an unfamiliar vulnerability emerges. For the first time, they feel powerless, unprepared, and exposed. They see that the stability they believed was theirs by design was never theirs. At all, it was granted through the obedience, discernment, and spiritual alignment of the one they mistreated. Their pride falters, and their illusions crumble, leaving them to reckon with a future they can no longer manipulate or control. The absence of your presence, though, their pride falters, and their illusions crumble, leaving them to reckon with a future they can no longer manipulate or control. The absence of your presence does more than reveal weakness. It unmasks character. It shows them who they are without the buffer of grace and mercy. The structures they built, the defenses they relied on, and the control they assumed are all stripped bare. What remains is the consequence of living without the covering they never appreciated, facing the outcome of choices they thought would go unnoticed. And in that empty, unshielded space, they begin to see what they lost. Not just a person, but the spiritual authority, the patience, the strength, and the protection that had silently governed their life. What happens when a narcissist finally sees the truth of their own exposure? When the one who carried the spiritual covering steps away, the world they thought was safe and manageable suddenly becomes a landscape of uncertainty. No longer softened by your patience, restrained by your wisdom, or protected by your presence. Every choice they made now stands in full relief, unfiltered and undeniable. They realize, with a sudden sharpness, that the calm they assumed was natural had always been borrowed. The narcissist begins to feel the consequences they once escaped. Doors that opened at a whim now remain firmly closed. Opportunities that flowed effortlessly when you were near seem obstructed and distant. The relationships they once controlled slip from their grasp, revealing the fragility of connections built on manipulation rather than authenticity. Every half-truth, every unkind word, every subtle betrayal resurfaces, no longer cushioned by grace or softened by intercession. They are left to face the full measure of their actions, and it is overwhelming. They begin to understand, perhaps for the first time, that your presence was never about their comfort. It was about containment. Every moment they believed they were in control was actually a moment where heaven was orchestrating restraint through you. The patience, the silence, the gentleness, they were not signs of weakness, but of immense spiritual authority. Each word they misread, each gesture they undervalued, was a layer of protection they could never replicate. As this clarity sinks in, fear begins to emerge. Not the fear of being caught, or fear of punishment, but the fear of what life truly looks like, without the unseen shield that kept chaos at bay. They recognize that every disaster avoided, every relationship preserved, every consequence softened was a direct result of your obedience to a higher calling. And now, with that obedience removed, they face life unguarded, vulnerable, and unprepared. The narcissist also feels the absence in subtle ways. A conversation that would have been guided by your wisdom turns tense. A conflict that would have been softened by your restraint now escalates. The emotional storms they once incited are no longer controlled. They experience instability in ways they never imagined because the instrument of balance, the very one they dismissed, has been withdrawn. For the first time, they are forced to see that their power was never absolute. The control they believed they held over people, over circumstances, and over outcomes was only as strong as the cover provided by the one they underestimated. And as they process this, the truth hits deeper. No replacement can restore what was lost. The spiritual weight, the discernment, the grace, and the authority that accompanied your presence cannot be duplicated. The narcissist world, once seemingly invincible, is now exposed to the consequences of its own foundation. They are confronted with the reality that their mistreatment did not go unnoticed, and that the mercy they took for granted had a limit. And in this revelation, they are left not with vengeance or punishment, but with the stark, unshielded truth. They had counted on a presence that was never theirs to command, and now it is gone. This is a moment of undeniable clarity, the kind that strips illusions, shakes pride, and reveals the cost of ignoring divine timing. Have you ever wondered what it feels like for someone who believed they were untouchable to suddenly realize their safety net is gone? For the narcissist, this moment arrives like a quiet thunder. The absence of your presence, the withdrawal of the spiritual shield you carried, unveils the reality they had avoided for so long. What they once dismissed as trivial, weak, or inconsequential now bears a weight they cannot deny. Every choice, every harsh word, every manipulation comes into sharp focus, and the illusion of control collapses around them. They begin to understand the depth of their misjudgment. Every instance they assumed your silence or patience meant fear. Every time they interpreted restraint as weakness was a miscalculation. Heaven had guided your actions, restraining the force within you until the appointed moment. Your calm was never surrender. Your silence was never avoidance. It was strategic obedience, a spiritual discipline that preserved not just yourself, but even them from consequences they were not strong enough to face. Now, stripped of that protective presence, the narcissist sees that the grace they enjoyed was never earned. Every moment where their schemes did not backfire, every crisis that dissolved before it consumed them, every opportunity that seemed effortless, all of it was buffered by the strength and faithfulness you carried. They feel the absence immediately. The atmosphere around them changes. Doors remain shut, paths close, opportunities vanish, and the weight of their own actions presses down with a clarity they cannot ignore. They also confront a deeper realization. The world they controlled was never truly under their command. The peace, the stability, the smoothness of life they had assumed it came from their own influence. But in truth, it came from the spiritual covering they misread, the authority they never possessed, the restraint you were called to hold. The illusion of power crumbles, leaving them exposed to the consequences they cannot manipulate or soften. This awakening is devastating because it reveals that their perceived superiority was built on borrowed strength. The calm they relied upon to maintain their image, to sustain relationships, and to navigate life was never theirs. It was always connected to the presence you carried. And as this truth settles in, panic rises. They realized they were not the anchors of the life they controlled. They were dependent on the one they underestimated. Even their attempts to manipulate or charm others no longer work. People begin to respond not to the narcissist's carefully crafted image, but to the reality of their character. Lies, half-truths, and selfish intentions are exposed. Relationships, which once bent to their will, now reveal the cracks they never addressed. Loneliness appears not as absence of people, but as absence of genuine connection, and they are left to face the hollowness of a life once cushioned by your obedience. This is when the narcissist realizes the stark truth. Your departure was never abandonment, never weakness, never loss in the romantic sense. It was the natural conclusion of divine timing, the completion of a season where grace had been extended through your presence. And now, with that covering removed, the consequences they once evaded begin to manifest fully, leaving them vulnerable, unshielded, and confronted by the weight of their own choices. What happens when a narcissist finally sees the full scope of their own decisions? When the spiritual shield they relied upon is gone, they encounter a reality they were never prepared to face. The grace they mistook for their own entitlement. The calm they believed reflected their control. The safety they assumed was a product of clever manipulation. All of it vanishes. And in that absence, a profound fear takes root. The narcissist begins to realize that for years, their actions were tempered not by merit or righteousness, but by the presence you carried. Every word they spoke without consequence, every harsh act that did not explode into retaliation, every manipulation that seemed to succeed, had been softened by divine timing and by your obedience. Your patience was not ignorance. Your silence was not weakness. Your endurance was not emotional dependence, it was spiritual authority. As this truth settles in, they start to confront the hollowness they cannot escape. Their relationships begin to reflect reality, shallow, unstable, and untrustworthy. They notice that charm and deception, tools that once ensured compliance and admiration, fail to yield the same results. People respond now to character, not image. Masks that once concealed selfish intentions start to crack, revealing flaws that were carefully hidden. The narcissist is forced to witness that the world around them was not controlled by manipulation, but maintained by the divine influence working through you. This awakening is not a gentle shock. It is a collapse of an identity meticulously constructed over years. Every assumption they held about power, authority, and influence is challenged. They must face the uncomfortable truth. They were never the anchor, the stabilizer, or the one in control. That role belonged to you, even if they never recognized it. Their pride shatters as they realize that they had been living under protection they neither earned nor deserved. And the weight of realization grows heavier when they recognize that the consequences they evaded for so long are now inevitable. The storms they once ignored, the decisions they once rationalized, the chaos they believed they could control all rise with clarity. There is no mediator, no buffer, no one to soften the impact. For the first time, they experience the consequences in their full intensity. Every choice, every action, every neglected responsibility lands squarely upon them. What breaks them further is the understanding that this moment was never about punishment. It was about truth. The absence of your presence reveals the natural outcome of their actions, showing the stark contrast between the life they imagined and the life they are now forced to inhabit. The spiritual authority you carried had been a restraining force, and without it, the reality they ignored becomes unavoidable. And in this quiet yet profound reckoning, the narcissist begins to see what they lost was never just a person. It was a vessel of mercy, a shield of grace, a stabilizing force that had preserved their world. The absence of that vessel leaves them exposed, vulnerable, and fully accountable. For the first time, they understand the true power and impact of your presence, and the magnitude of what their rejection has cost them. Have you ever wondered what it feels like for someone who always believed they were untouchable to suddenly see their world unravel? That is the moment the narcissist encounters reality without the divine shield you carried. The calm they assumed belonged to them, the opportunities they thought they earned, and the stability they believed reflected their control, all of it begins to slip through their fingers. They realize, with a creeping dread, that the presence they once dismissed was the very force holding everything together. The narcissist starts to recognize that every delay of consequence, every softened blow, and every narrow escape they enjoyed was tied to the strength you embodied, not to their cunning or charm. The patience you exercised was not an indication of submission. It was obedience to a higher purpose. Every measured response, every withheld word, every act of restraint was calibrated by divine wisdom. And now, removed from that influence, the consequences of years of manipulation, pride, and selfishness pressed down with undeniable weight. This revelation strikes at the core of their full sense of identity. For so long, they had believed themselves to be the orchestrators of every dynamic in the relationship. Their charm, their intimidation, their subtle coercion, they assumed these were the levers that maintained balance. But now they see the truth. It was never their skill. It was the spiritual authority you carried, acting as an invisible stabilizer, that ensured their chaos did not consume everything. Every time they tested boundaries and expected an eruption, every time they provoked for reaction, they were unaware that divine restraint was protecting them from themselves. The narcissist's fear grows as they witness the consequences they thought they could avoid rise unfiltered. Paths that once opened effortlessly now remain closed. Opportunities that once seemed guaranteed dry up. Relationships, once pliable under their influence, now mirror the reality of their character. There is no new supply, no external charm to salvage what has been lost. They see themselves fully exposed, stripped of the grace they had taken for granted. What hits hardest is the understanding that your presence was not just a companion or emotional support. It was a divine assignment. The grace, patience, and strength you carried were tied to a purpose beyond their comprehension. They were protected, buffered, and guided because you stood in obedience, not because of their worthiness. Now that you are removed, they confront the unavoidable consequences of their own choices without any intercession, shelter, or delay. And in this confrontation, something profound occurs. The narcissist realizes that the stability they assumed was theirs to command was never theirs at all. Every calm moment, every avoided disaster, every softened crisis had flowed through you. The absence of your influence exposes the fragility of their life, the hollowness of their pride, and the futility of their manipulations. It is not punishment, they simply face the natural unfolding of what they have sown. For the first time, the narcissist understands the weight of what they lost. It was not merely a person, but a divine presence, a vessel of protection and mercy. And now, stripped of that covering, they are left to encounter the consequences of a life lived in self-centeredness, arrogance, and manipulation. They face what they once ignored, avoided, or deferred, and in that silence, the truth pierces their spirit. They cannot replace the one God sent. Have you ever considered the gravity of someone realizing they were never the one in control? The narcissist believed every step, every action, and every emotion was theirs to direct. They assumed that their influence shaped your responses, that their manipulation dictated your peace. Yet now, stripped of your presence, the illusion shatters. The reality settles in like a cold shadow. They were never the architect of stability, the commander of outcomes, or the source of calm. That role belonged to you, and it was anchored in divine authority, not human effort. As the narcissist confronts this truth, panic and disbelief rise within them. Every mistake they assumed was inconsequential now carries weight. Every cruel word, every selfish act, every manipulation that once seemed harmless or productive now sits exposed in the harsh light of reality. They see, perhaps for the first time, that your silence was never weakness, your patience never fear, and your endurance never dependence. Each of these traits had been a vessel of restraint, a channel for mercy, and a shield against chaos that they themselves had sown. The unsettling awareness dawns slowly but inexorably. The power they believed they wielded was borrowed, temporary, and dependent entirely on the presence you carried. The narcissist begins to understand that the storms they expected to provoke never rose because divine timing, expressed through your obedience, held them at bay. You were not powerless. You were formidable, but your strength had been held back to align with a higher purpose. Their fear deepens as the realization sinks further. Every moment of apparent control they thought they had, every fleeting triumph, was contingent upon your restraint. Now that restraint is gone, the weight of consequences they had long avoided begins to settle around them. The narcissist sees doors closing that once opened, paths narrowing that once seemed endless, and the subtle advantages they relied upon evaporating without warning. They confront the truth. What they mistook for personal competence was actually your intercession and obedience to God's timing. And yet, the most piercing revelation is the irreplaceable nature of what they lost. They believed that anyone could step into the role you played, that your presence was incidental, expendable, unreplaceable. God's intervention proves otherwise. The grace, protection, and stability you carried were unique, assigned for a purpose far beyond their comprehension. Now, absent your influence, they experience life unshielded, unsoftened, and uncompromised by your mercy. In this stark new reality, the narcissist finally confronts their vulnerability, not physical, emotional, or relational, but spiritual. They see that the very person they tried to dominate was the one equipped to maintain divine order within the relationship. Your presence restrained consequences, softened their failures, and acted as a buffer between their choices and the natural outcome of those choices. Without you, the world responds to them exactly as it always should have. And in the quiet that follows, the narcissist is left face to face with the truth they cannot ignore. Their past cruelty, their pride, and their manipulations now collide with a reality they cannot control. They were never the central force. They were simply actors in a story orchestrated by divine authority. The weight of that revelation presses down, leaving a void where arrogance once lived, and a gnawing recognition that the one they lost cannot be replaced or duplicated. What does it feel like to stand alone and realize the shield that once softened every blow is gone? The narcissist, once convinced of their invincibility, now experiences the emptiness that follows the withdrawal of your presence. They had assumed your compassion, patience, and forgiveness existed to support them. They had interpreted your silence as submission, your endurance as weakness, and your calm as fear. Yet in truth, each of these traits was a manifestation of spiritual obedience, a restraint placed upon you to align with divine timing. Every act of mercy you offered was not a concession to their demands, but a reflection of God's purpose flowing through you. As the narcissist confronts this reality, a sense of destabilization begins to creep in. The small advantages they relied on vanish one by one. Situations that once bent in their favor now resist their control. Their expectations of immediate influence crumble as the absence of your intercession becomes undeniable. The grace they once mistook for their own virtue is no longer present to soften outcomes or delay consequences. Suddenly, they face the natural unfolding of choices they long avoided. The comfort they assumed was earned reveals itself to have been borrowed from your obedience and divine authority. This revelation strikes at the core of their identity. They begin to see that the person they dismissed, mocked, or manipulated was never the fragile one. You were the instrument maintaining balance, the source of stability, and the anchor for both their life and the surrounding environment. Each act they believed exposed weakness was actually met with power restrained, a power rooted in spiritual discernment and obedience. They realized that you were never the one who needed saving. Instead, you were the one sent as a protector, a shield, and a vessel of mercy that prevented the full weight of their actions from falling upon them prematurely. The depth of this truth leaves them vulnerable. Every attempt to manipulate or control, every emotional ploy, and every self-serving act that once succeeded now encounters resistance, not from human force, but from the absence of the divine protection you carried. Life begins to respond to them according to the natural order they once ignored. The consequences of pride, deceit, and cruelty no longer meet. Delay they arrive with unfiltered clarity. And with that clarity comes the realization of irreversibility. The narcissist understood that your presence was never interchangeable, your role never replaceable, and the grace you carried never duplicable. No charm, no apology, and no superficial gesture could reproduce the protective covering you embodied. Every opportunity they squandered now stands exposed, leaving them face to face with a future defined by the absence of divine mercy channeled through your obedience. At this moment, they confront a reality long denied. The one they sought to dominate was the very one keeping them upright. Without you, life is harsher, consequences are immediate, and the illusions they relied on crumble. Your departure was not an escape. It was the completion of a divine plan, a removal of the buffer they mistook for their own stability. The narcissist stands stripped of false authority, witnessing the unfolding of outcomes that had been held in check by your faithful presence. In this silent reckoning, the magnitude of what they lost begins to weigh upon them. They do not simply miss a person, they face the collapse of a structure, the withdrawal of a shield, and the inevitability of consequences long delayed. And in this stillness, a profound truth emerges. Your obedience was not for them, it was for divine purpose. What unfolds in a person's spirit when every place they once controlled begins to reject the very behavior they built their identity on? That is the moment the narcissist realizes the environment no longer bends to their desires. It is as if the atmosphere around them shifts, revealing a truth they never wanted to face. Their tone no longer persuades, their charm no longer captivates, their silent threats no longer intimidate. The world responds differently now, and they cannot understand why every familiar strategy suddenly fails. This shift is not accidental. It is the natural consequence of the removal of the spiritual covering you once carried. Your presence had acted like a filter through which every interaction was softened, balanced, and aligned. You responded with patience where others would have reacted with anger. You offered compassion where others would have withdrawn. You maintained peace where others would have confronted. The narcissist benefited from this environment without ever acknowledging its source. They mistook your restraint for passivity, unaware that your choices were guided not by fear but by divine wisdom. Now, without that influence present, life begins to mirror the truth of their character. Conversations turn cold, opportunities grow distant, connections they once manipulated drift away. People begin to see the patterns that were previously hidden by the calm you carried. The narcissist discovers, to their shock, that their behavior is not sustainable in an atmosphere shaped by justice rather than mercy. It is not punishment, they simply encounter the reality that had been held back by your obedience. As days unfold, a new awareness emerges within them. They remember moments when everything seemed to fall into place and now realize those moments were tied to your presence. They recall conflicts that did not escalate, blessings that seemed unearned, and second chances they did not deserve. Each memory becomes a quiet reminder of the stability you once provided. Your influence prevented destruction, softened consequences, and kept their life from spiraling into chaos. Their inner world begins to shift as this truth grows clearer. They feel the weight of decisions they once dismissed as minor. They sense the distance in relationships they thought they controlled. They experience emotional storms they used to redirect toward you. Without your presence absorbing their imbalance, they face the full impact of their own choices. The loneliness they feel is not just physical, it is spiritual. It is the silence that follows the removal of a divine assignment. The narcissist now recognizes a truth they long avoided. They were never the foundation. You were the stabilizing presence, the one balancing spiritual weight, and the one acting in obedience even when misunderstood. Every attempt they made to diminish you was an attempt to destroy the very protection preserving them. And now that this covering is withdrawn, they stand alone, exposed to the consequences once held back for their sake. In this moment of clarity, their pride cracks. They begin to see that the loss they experience is not the loss of control, admiration, or compliance. It is the loss of the one who carried grace into every moment. A quiet fear settles in as they realize that nothing in their life can return to what it once was. The covering is gone, the mercy is lifted, and the absence of your presence reveals just how much they depended on the strength they never honored. Have you ever noticed how a life once buffered by another's prayers can suddenly feel unbearably exposed when that protection is withdrawn? For the narcissist, this is the awakening they never anticipated. They had believed the calm around them was a reflection of their own brilliance, their own skill at navigating life. Yet now, stripped of your presence, they confront a reality that is unrelenting. The serenity they enjoyed was never theirs to claim. It was borrowed, extended through your obedience, and sustained by the grace you carried. The moment you stepped away, the consequences they had long delayed began to manifest. Every careless choice, every manipulation, every act of cruelty they had previously avoided facing now pressed against them like a weight too heavy to bear. The obstacles that once seemed to vanish before their eyes now blocked every path. Opportunities that opened with ease when you were near now remained firmly closed. They quickly realized that life without the covering you provided was harsher, more unyielding, and entirely uncompromising. This is when the narcissist begins to sense the depth of what they lost. They remember moments where storms could have erupted but didn't, times when their actions could have destroyed relationships but were quietly stabilized. Every instance where their behavior did not provoke disaster was now understood in a new light. Your presence was the buffer that prevented life from crashing in on them. The weight of this realization hits like a cold wind. For so long, they assumed their control was absolute. They believed that people, circumstances, and even God's patience would bend to their will. Now, that illusion shatters. Suddenly, their strategies, so meticulously crafted over the years, no longer yield results. Manipulation falls flat. Charm is ignored. Coercion is powerless. Every attempt to reclaim dominance is met with resistance that cannot be circumvented. And the most startling truth emerges. The very power they assumed they held over your life, and by extension over their own outcomes, was never theirs. It was always God's power flowing through you, mediated by your faithfulness and restraint. This revelation is devastating because it forces them to confront a deeper truth. They were never the source of stability. They were never the anchor. Their authority was always limited, restrained, and counterbalanced by your obedience. Every time they believed they were provoking fear, anger, or submission, they were unknowingly navigating a terrain defined by divine intervention. The narcissist sees now that the life they thought was under their control was fact, shaped by someone they underestimated. Their presence they dismissed, disrespected, and assumed powerless. And so, a quiet panic sets in. They begin to understand that the absence of your covering is not merely the absence of a person, it is the absence of protection, grace, and spiritual authority. Their foundation begins to crack as they realize the true extent of their dependence on someone they believed was weak. The calm they once enjoyed, the ease they once relied on, the mercy they thought was incidental are gone. Life now demands that they face the full measure of their own choices, unshielded, unsoftened, and uncompromised. The narcissist learns, finally, that no charm, no manipulation, no self-serving act can replace what was lost. And with that, the gravity of reality sinks in. The shield is removed. The buffer is gone, and they stand exposed to the consequences they have long evaded. Before we conclude, take a moment to feel the weight of what has been revealed. When the narcissist loses the covering that once softened the impact of their choices, the consequences arrive not as punishment, but as unfiltered truth. Life responds naturally to actions, and without your presence standing in the gap, the patterns they cultivated finally come to light. The storms they once navigated with apparent ease now crash upon them unimpeded. The relationships they manipulated fracture more quickly. The stability they assumed was theirs evaporates, revealing the reality they had avoided for so long. This is not a tale of vengeance, but of divine timing. It is a lesson in obedience and spiritual authority, in understanding that faithfulness has a purpose beyond immediate perception. Your patience, your restraint, your compassions, these were never signs of weakness. They were instruments of God's design, shields placed to protect not just the innocent, but to allow the narcissist to confront life in a way they could not have withstood alone. When the shield is removed, the world responds honestly, without distortion, revealing the fullness of consequences that had been delayed. The narcissist faces the reality that the one they underestimated, mistreated, and sought to control was in fact carrying a strength they could not comprehend. They are confronted with the truth that their former authority was limited, and their perceived control a borrowed illusion. Every charm, every manipulation, every carefully constructed mask no longer works when the covering has stepped away. They are left with a stark and undeniable vision. Life responds to character, not image, to truth, not deception, to obedience, not manipulation. And while the narcissist experiences the impact of absence, you step forward into a new chapter, one defined not by conflict, not by control, but by divine purpose. Every decision, every moment of restraint, every act of obedience has positioned you in alignment with a plan far greater than human understanding. The storms you endured, the silence you maintained, and the patience you exercised have created a path of clarity, freedom, and spiritual authority that belongs only to you. You walk forward, not in fear, not in resentment, but in the quiet assurance that your obedience has fulfilled its purpose. The revelation for the narcissist is permanent. The one they mistreated was irreplaceable, not because of sentiment or emotional attachment, but because of divine assignment. Your presence was a shield, a barrier, and a vessel of mercy. Without it, The reality of their choices is unavoidable. They must confront consequences that were previously softened, paths that now demand accountability, and a life that no longer bends to their ego. It is a moment of clarity that may be painful, but it is truth fully realized. As you reflect on this, remember that your journey has been guided, protected, and prepared. The trials you faced were not signs of weakness, but opportunities to demonstrate faithfulness under divine instruction. Your endurance, your restraint, and your spiritual obedience have accomplished what human effort alone could not. And in this realization lies peace, purpose, and the quiet justice of heaven.